I had visited my family for the holidays and was driving back home. The trip in total was about 10 hours, which I split into 2 drives on the way up. But on the way back, I decided to power through it in one long drive. Around the halfway point, snow started coming down. It wasn't too much, so I wasn't worried about it. However, it got worse as I kept driving. Once I was 3 hours away from home, it was pouring down pretty heavily, and with the sun going down as well, it definitely was not ideal. There were almost no other cars out though, which is the only reason I decided to keep driving. The snow made it harder, but I was still on track to be home by the end of the night. It was just after the sun had fully set, and about 30 minutes out from the nearest town I just passed through, that I noticed a car on the road ahead of me. Their headlights were the only light on the road in the middle of the blanket of snow covering everything else. And as I got closer, it was clear that they were stuck, or at least not moving. Their car was sideways on the road, with their hazard lights flickering, and a man was standing out in the cold next to it. Obviously, with the snow and cold, I really didn't want to stop, but it seemed I didn't have a choice. His car was blocking most of the road off that was paved. I parked just behind him. The man immediately started waving at me and walked up to my window. "My car slid and got stuck there. Can you help me push it out?" He spoke slowly, like his English wasn't the best, but hoping I could get back on the road as soon as possible, I agreed to help him. The car didn't really look like it was in too much snow, so maybe just a little push might actually be enough. I threw my hat and gloves on, then got out. The wind hitting my face and snow instantly soaking me made me wonder why the guy even got out of his car and didn't just call for help. My face and hands were already getting numb, so I hurried to the back of his car and waited for him to get his gloves. It was too dark to see anything through the windows, and after a little bit of standing back there waiting, I looked around to see what was taking him so long. He was still leaning into the front seat, as if looking for his gloves, but I thought I heard him talking. A second later, he came back out and looked at me. Were you talking to me?" I asked. He looked concerned, but said he was just talking to himself. He smiled, then walked around to the back to help me push. I couldn't help but feel like something had changed though. His whole demeanor and the situation just felt different. Although I didn't hear what he said, it didn't really sound like he was talking to himself. But if someone else was in the car, then why was he out here alone and asking for my help? All these thoughts came rushing through my head, and I guess for a few seconds I was kind of spaced out. So much so that I didn't notice the man staring at me. His smile had dropped, and he had an eerie look in his eyes, like they were hollow and lifeless, completely opposite of what he looked like before. I didn't even hesitate, beginning to hurry back to my car. Just then, several doors from the car I was just behind opened, and 3 more men got out, rushing toward me. I sprinted into my driver's seat, and thank goodness I left my car on, because I put it straight in drive and rolled past them, almost hitting one on the way out. I was terrified of possibly getting stuck in the snowbank, as the path around their car was very thin, but thankfully I made it around and was able to get away. I put in a report with the police at the closest town, but there were never any updates as far as I know. I'm assuming the men weren't really stuck, and probably left right after I did. I don't know what those men were up to. Of course, I have my guesses, but if I had stayed and didn't leave right when I did, who knows where I'd be. This was last year. It was late November, and this was the first snowfall of the season. It wasn't supposed to be anything too much, just a couple inches of snow. I got home from work around 8, and by then the snow had already started. I heated up some leftover pizza and stayed downstairs for a couple hours. Around 10, I went upstairs to my bedroom, sitting at my desk with my laptop. Before I could even open up something to watch, I heard something right above me. It sounded like a thud in the ceiling. I thought it was likely the snow weighing down on the roof, and was probably nothing to be concerned about. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned at all, though. This was my first winter at this house, and it wasn't in the best shape, so part of me was a little worried about any possible leaks or other problems. I tried to not think about it too much and continued looking for something to watch, but then it happened again. A thud resonating through the ceiling. I looked up, and the thuds continued, sounding almost in a straight line across the ceiling. I was genuinely worried now. I got up and grabbed my winter jacket, then hurried out the front door and looked up at the roof. Unexpectedly, the side of the roof that my bedroom was under, there was no snow on it. It had all slid off and fell into a pile in front of the house. I looked at the other side of the roof, and the snow was still there. I then looked at my neighbors' homes, and all of them still had snow sitting on their roofs like normal. The way the snow had fallen off just one side of my roof didn't seem natural, like something was either wrong with my roof or something else had made this happen. Probably whatever those thuds were that I was hearing. With no more answers to find outside, and my whole body starting to shiver from the cold, I walked back to the front door. I opened it and hurried inside, stomping my boots on the doormat. When I looked up, though, my heart almost stopped. There were puddles of water going across the hallway. I stayed still and looked around, seeing water going through the living room and even up the stairs next to me. It only took me a second to see a boot print in one of the puddles, and I immediately turned right back around and headed out the door. I stood by the road and called the police, shivering as I tried to tell them my situation. About 30 seconds into the call, I saw something move past one of the windows in my bedroom, and moments later, a figure stood behind the glass, looking down at me. They only stayed for a second, then backed away. I didn't see anything else the rest of the time that I waited for the police. As I was waiting, though, I put together most of the pieces in my mind. Someone had made it up on the roof, making the snow fall as they walked across. There were several windows they could have gotten in from that I honestly had no idea if they were locked or not. When police arrived, they didn't find the intruder inside anymore, but they basically confirmed my theory. There were multiple trees going over top my house that anyone could easily climb, and with the windows being accessible, it made for an easy target. At least, the officers think that that's the reason they broke in, just because I was an easy target. Nothing was missing though, and the way the shoe prints went through the whole house felt eerily like them looking for me. What's crazy is that I must have gone outside to check on the roof at the exact time they got in through the window. If I was any later, I would have been face to face with them, or if I'd gone back inside sooner, they might have not left tracks through the house yet for me to immediately notice. It's been nearly an entire year since this, and so far nothing else has happened. Maybe it was just a one-time attempt, but I don't think I'll ever feel safe with all the uncertainties of what happened that night. It was mid-December. I was only 17 at the time, and every year just before Christmas week, my mom had to go on a 3-day business trip for work. Being an only child that lived just with my mom, I'd spend these days that she was gone home alone. Usually she'd leave just before winter break, so I'd be in school for most of the day. But this year she left the same day that our school let out for the holidays. I had the house to myself and wanted nothing more than to stay inside and chill all day. Our city was going through somewhat of a snowstorm, so I couldn't really leave the house anyway. I made some of the food that was left for me, and found a new movie to watch. I had to pause it several times throughout the couple hours though, because the wind and snow would suddenly pick up and get really loud. It seemed like every time I looked outside, the weather was worse. Then, around 7 or 8, someone was walking up to the front door. I could hear their footsteps kicking against the snow, and they coughed several times as they slowly made their way up to the porch. I didn't have a clue who it could be. I paused everything and looked at the door, waiting for them to knock or ring the doorbell. As more time passed though, I could feel myself getting nervous, as something didn't feel right. I want to say I waited 3 or 4 minutes, not hearing anything, before I went up to the door and looked outside. Nobody was there. I could see the footsteps coming right up to the door, then going back the way they came. I was really confused how clearly I heard them walk up, but somehow I didn't hear them leave. Also, with the snowstorm outside, what reason could someone have to come up to my house? I think the only reason I could settle on was that the snow made it difficult to see, and they mistook my house for theirs. Maybe they realized once they got up to the porch and didn't want to alarm anyone, so they quietly left. It's probably a bit of a stretch, but I guess it was possible. After a while, I'd mostly stopped thinking about the situation and was more caught up worrying about the storm. The power cut out a few times, lasting for several minutes before it came back on. Because of that, I couldn't really watch TV or anything, so I just sat on the couch and scrolled on my phone. It was maybe around 11, when through the harsh wind, I heard a thump against the house. I initially ignored it, but only a few moments later, the power cut out again. Thinking the thump might have caused it, I got up. It sounded like it was from the side near the kitchen, so I turned my phone light on, then walked over and looked around. I thought it was probably just a coincidence that the power shut off right after I heard the thump, but I just wanted to be sure nothing happened. I didn't see anything, and I started to walk away. Hey! I jumped and looked at the back door, seeing a man standing against the other side. The back porch light wasn't on, so he was mostly covered by the dark. I could only see his face peering in at me. Hey, kid, would you get the door for me? It's freezing out here, he said, putting his hand on the door and trying to open it. My head wasn't fully grasping the situation yet, and I kind of just stood there and stared at him. Kid, get the door, please. Something gave me a bad feeling. I knew better than to trust this guy, even though it was a blizzard outside. The man started coughing, and I started to back up, and the man's face instantly fell into a disturbing frown. Open the fucking door, he yelled, banging his fist against it several times. I ran back to the couch and got my phone. I then stood in the hallway and watched the man as I dialed 911. My phone was struggling to hold service and kept dropping the call, but after a few tries, I was able to get through long enough to ask for help. The man at the door continued to yell at me and hit the door, but eventually ran off. I'm assuming the snowstorm caused some trouble for the police, as they didn't make it until nearly 30 minutes after. I told them what I could, and I called my mom to let her know what happened. Nobody really knew what to think of it. He could have been stalking me and trying to guilt me into letting him in, or he could have actually been in need of help, although it's unlikely. I never saw him again after that night, though. I work at a gas station. I'd been there for several years, and this night was one that I assumed would be like all the rest. I came in at 8 and took over for the day worker, who went home right away. The first couple hours went by quickly, as there were still customers coming in regularly to buy a few things or to pay for gas with cash. Between 11 and 12, it slowed down, to where it began feeling like the shift was dragging on. I kept myself busy for another hour, or at least tried to, with stocking whatever I could find, but then I was left with the dreaded second half of my shift. It was always slow, boring, and just not enjoyable. Around 1 though, a car pulled in and parked in the spaces by the entrance door. A few other cars had come through recently, but just to get gas real quick. Very rarely would someone actually park in the spots and come into the store this late into the night. I stood up straight and tried to rub the tired look off my face, expecting them to come in. A couple minutes went by though, and they didn't. I leaned over the counter and looked out the glass door, but couldn't really see anything. The reflections on the door were blocking any way for me to see inside their car. Maybe they were just taking a break from a long drive. I didn't bother caring too much about it. I sat back and pulled up my phone. I spaced out, reading through random articles and whatnot for probably 20 or so minutes. During that time, I never heard anything or saw anything, but eventually I looked up from my phone and my heart almost stopped. There was a guy inside the store, standing in one of the aisles and looking right at me. His eyes darted away as soon as I saw him. This guy looked like he was mid-40, with a dark jacket on and a scruffy beard. I never saw or heard him enter, so how the hell did he get in? While my mind was racing, I just watched as the man kept walking around, glancing over at me a few times to see if I was looking, like he was planning to do something as soon as I looked away. Then, after just 30 seconds, he suddenly hurried toward the front door and ran outside. I got up and ran to look out. This was when I noticed the car was still there, but the guy walked right past it and just out to the road until I could no longer see him. I immediately went to the cameras to see how he got in and figure out what was going on. It only took me a minute to find the footage of him slowly and quietly getting out of the car, then going to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras back there, but those doors were never locked since the gas station was technically always open anyway. What's really odd is that there were 15 minutes between the time he went around to the back to the time he walked out onto the sales floor. Police came to help me investigate, ultimately finding the car he left to have been a stolen vehicle from months ago. They didn't know anything about the guy or his motives. Sneaking around though, he clearly had something else intended for that night, and I think I was really lucky that for one reason or another, he decided not to go through with it.
I was on a week-long hunting trip, and I was staying in my uncle's cabin in the dead middle of winter. It was a long day, and I was about to head back to the cabin shortly. It had been snowing lightly on and off all day, but out of nowhere the snow picked up very quickly and turned into a very dense snowstorm. It was getting late, and I had a long way to walk back to the cabin, and I was honestly terrified. Because it felt like every minute that passed by, the storm was getting worse and worse. It was almost a miracle that I saw a light up ahead. It was a really bright light, but it shines dimly from where I could see, just enough for me to notice it. As I got closer, I soon realized it was another cabin. My adrenaline instantly sparked, and I was happy to have found potential shelter. I would have had to walk miles upon miles in that blizzard to get back to my uncle's cabin, and I would have been screwed. I thought for sure I would have found myself lost in the blizzard searching for my cabin had I taken that route instead. Knowing what I know now though, and with what happened to me, I wish I would have just manned the fuck up and found my way back to my cabin. But I could barely even see what was in front of me. And ultimately, that played a huge part in the final decision of me trying to get in contact with whoever was inside. I was just hoping my luck wouldn't have run out completely. What was the chance this guy was actually going to be a serial killer or something like that? I convinced myself that shelter was worth the risk. I approached the cabin and I knocked on the door. I heard footsteps that seemed like they were getting closer to me. I waited another 30 seconds maybe and politely knocked once again. The man opened the door and I explained to him my situation. He let me in with open arms and let me stay for the night, surprisingly. I told him I would be gone first thing in the morning. This guy kind of gave me the creeps, but being totally serious here, I wasn't that worried about it. People out here were known for being that way. Not necessarily creepy, but I could sense he wasn't the extroverted type, let me just put it that way. He barely spoke to me at all. He gave me a pillow and told me I could sleep on his couch in the main room. I tried making small talk with him, but that didn't go very well. I didn't want to bother him, so I thanked him once again for letting me stay, and I told him I was going to try and get some rest. I laid my head down on the pillow and I was getting ready to relax. The man was now standing behind me, so he was completely out of my sight. I was waiting for him to walk away, but he stood there for a good 30 seconds or so and he didn't make a sound. I thought that was kind of weird, but still, I didn't think much of it. Then he turned the light off over the sink, which was the only light that was still on in the cabin at the time. I figured that meant he was finally going to lay down as well, but I was wrong. He walked away towards his room and I started to doze off within minutes. What the fuck was that? I sat up so quick that I almost threw myself off of the couch. I looked back and all around me, but it was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. "Everything all right back there?" I asked. But there was no reply. To which I then stated, "Alright, good night then." I was genuinely starting to get anxious, and I started to rethink my decision of staying there. Convinced myself that it was nothing though, and that I should just try to fall back asleep. I finally fell asleep maybe 15 to 20 minutes after that, and I have no idea how long I was out for, when all of a sudden, I awoke to the guy on top of me. At first he was literally only just laying on me, a long ways. His body was stiff as ever. I awoke within seconds and I tried to get him off me. He was much stronger than me though. He then started choking me and smelling me, and like smelling my hair and touching my face. He even tried to kiss me. I managed to headbutt him, which in turn gave me just enough time to gain the upper hand and throw him off of me. I ran for the door immediately and I forgot. Shit. Just as I was about to leave, I realized I couldn't leave without my gun. I turned back around to grab it, and there he was pointing my own rifle at me. I was close enough to him and fast enough that I managed to duck and weave and disarm the man. He was a bit older and that gave me the confidence to do what I had done. I hit him with the butt of my rifle and I ran out the door. It was still snowing out really bad, but I could tell that it lightened up just a bit. It was a long night and it took me hours to find my cabin as I had to walk at least 2 miles. And that's if I took a linear path to the cabin. I was walking around aimlessly for quite some time, just winging it, in 7 to 8 inches of snow in the middle of the night, with a snowstorm clouding my vision on top of that. I later found out from the police that the person who owned that cabin had mysteriously disappeared years ago, and no one has owned it since. That legit gave me shivers when the officer told me that. That guy was going to kill me. Scariest thing about it is, I don't think they caught the guy yet either. Two winters ago, my dad got me a car for my birthday. Not only was it new, but it was also my first car. I had just gotten my license a month prior, and my father felt that I earned it. I was really excited, but the only problem was that we had just got hit with a really bad snowstorm. Literally the same day, the day of my birthday. So obviously that meant I wasn't going to be able to do any driving anytime soon. Until the snow at least cleared up a bit anyways. I was really bummed out about the snowstorm, but I was thankful for the car. Skip ahead to that same night, I was sitting in my room, and I was pondering the decision of taking my new car for a spin. I almost convinced myself to do it, but I knew my dad would kill me if he found out that I snuck out and drove without his permission, and especially with how shitty the roads were. The roads were absolutely horrible, and I knew it was a bad idea, so I decided against it. Fast forward to the next night, I had been telling all my friends about my car and how excited I was. My friend Eric ended up asking me if I wanted to hang out that night, but I told him I couldn't. He later stated that he really wanted to get out of the house because I guess his dad was being shitty again or something. I don't want to get into this part too much, but basically from what I understand, Eric's dad is a horrible person that has been physically abusing him for years now. Eric said his dad had another drunken outburst and practically begged me to pick him up, so I did. After all, I wasn't going to leave my friend there all alone and not do something about it. I made my way out to the car and I had to sneak out my bedroom window. As I was driving down the road along the way, I noticed an old man in the middle of the road. I could barely see him because it was snowing quite heavily and I didn't have enough time to stop because the roads were so icy. But I had no choice other than to slam on my brakes in a panic because I was about to hit the man. The wheels lost all traction and I very quickly started to spin out. Before I knew it, I was swerving onto the other side of the road and I crashed into a ditch. I started panicking, not sure what to do. All I could think about was how fucked I was and that once my dad found out, he was going to literally murder me. The man from earlier that was in the middle of the road made his way over to me, to my driver's side door, and asked me if I was okay. I told him that I was fine and that I wasn't hurt at all. I got the creeps from this man right off the bat, and I really wanted him to get the hell away from me, honestly. I politely as possible told him to leave me alone and that I had to go. He got the hint and he stepped away from my car. I wasn't even paying much attention to where he went. All I know is that he continued walking the way he was going when I first saw him, which was the opposite direction that I was going. I reached for my phone so I could call my dad to pick me up, but that was when I realized my phone wasn't in my pocket. I began looking all over for it and I searched my car everywhere. I knew I didn't forget to bring it with me when I left the house because I vividly remember typing in Eric's address in my Maps app on my iPhone because I didn't quite remember how to get to his house. The only thing I could do was run home, and luckily I didn't make it too far in my car before I spun out because I would have had to have walked a lot further than the 3 or 4 miles that I had to walk. When I got home, I told my dad everything and he was pissed. He managed to pull my car out of the ditch with his truck and he had my mom drive it home. He ended up taking the keys from me, and he told me that we would talk about it all tomorrow, and I felt horrible for what I'd done. I've actually never seen my dad that upset in my entire life. As I was lying in bed that night, I was still trying to figure out where my phone was. I was getting really angry because I had no idea what I did with it. I couldn't find it anywhere. I honestly thought that in my heart I lost it somehow when I crashed and that it was buried in the snow somewhere. Even though that seemed extremely unlikely to me at the time, that's the only thing I could think of that felt somewhat logical. All of a sudden, I heard something that sounded like it came from outside. It jump scared me pretty bad as I was deep in thought, and the last thing I expected was someone or something to be at my window. I chalked it up to be that it was probably just an animal, and I forgot about it completely with only a few minutes. I wish I wouldn't have let my guard down so fast though, because maybe, just maybe, things would have went down a lot differently than they did that night. All of a sudden, I heard a knocking sound that right away I could tell came from my window. I turned my head and looked over at the window so fast that it hurt my neck. There was a guy standing there a few feet from the window outside looking in. I couldn't tell who it was or what he looked like because it was too dark. All I could make out was that he was kind of tall and had long hair, like the guy from earlier, I thought. I couldn't believe what I saw, and I immediately ran to get my dad again. When we came back to my room, my bedroom window was wide open and my phone was sitting on my bed. I had no idea what to make of it all at first, but it had to have been that man from earlier that I spoke with briefly after the crash. He must have followed me home. Why the hell would he have taken my phone? And if he was attempting to steal it, why would he bring it back? If he was just trying to do a good deed, why the hell would he sneak through my damn window in the middle of the night instead of knocking on the front door like a normal person? Of course, we looked all over for him, hoping he wasn't still in our house. My dad and I spent over 20 minutes easily looking for him, but he was gone. We called the police, but there wasn't much we could do. With the little evidence we had, I could give them a description of the man, but that was about it. Just under a week later, I saw him once again. It was in our backyard in the middle of the night, doing who knows what. I walked outside as soon as I saw him, and I yelled at him from the back patio and told him to leave and to never come back. I got my dad as well, and once again, by the time my dad showed up to the scene, he was gone. I'm not sure what the hell this guy wanted or what he was trying to do, but I haven't seen him since the last time I just told you about. I still get the occasional thought about him and that he's going to try to come back at some point, even though this happened 2 years ago. Needless to say, I learned my lesson that night about a couple things. Just a couple of years ago, I was going on a long road trip for work. I used to go on these trips often in my old job, but recent events ultimately led to me getting a new job. The roads were horrible, and if it weren't for work, I wouldn't have been driving. The snow was only getting worse, and it was only getting later and later into the night. I decided to stop at a nearby hotel that was up ahead, a few exits down on the highway. Hopefully the roads will be clear in the morning, I thought, or at least better than they are now. When I arrived, I went to the front desk and I told the worker I needed a room for the night. I paid for it and I made my way to the room. I was thinking about going to sleep because after all, I was exhausted from driving all day, but at the same time, I felt like I needed to move around. I had been driving all day like stated previously, so my body was sore from sitting in the same position for hours on end. If you have ever drove for a prolonged amount of time, then you would know what I'm talking about. I decided to get some food, and after I ate, I let my stomach digest, and I decided that I wanted to go for a quick swim in the pool. The hotel had a nice indoor pool, along with a hot tub. I was the only person at the pool, and it was quite relaxing and much needed. But then I noticed a guy out of the corner of my eye who startled me. He was on the far left side towards the back of the pool area, in a dark, dimly lit corner sitting down on one of the plastic chairs. I didn't notice him when I first arrived at the pool, nor did I notice him walk in while I was there. I kinda just figured that maybe he was a lifeguard or someone that worked there, but he gave me the creeps. He kept staring at me, and every time I looked at him, he would look away. I started to feel weird, so I got out of the pool shortly after. I barely even dried off, and I walked back to my room. I put dry clothes on, and I walked out to the hall and headed to the main lobby area so I could get myself something to drink and a few snacks before bed. When I got back into my room, I turned the TV on and settled in before I was going to try and sleep to help me relax a little. It wasn't too long after that I heard a noise that sounded like it came from the outside of my hotel room. It sounded much closer though. There was no one in the room with me, not that I knew of anyways. I heard the noise again, except this time it was much louder and I could definitely tell where it was coming from. I was almost 100% sure that it was coming from the bathroom in my room. I panicked and I sat there for a few seconds, probably trying to rationalize the situation I was in as a coping mechanism. Part of me didn't want to believe what was happening, I'm sure. I finally snapped out of it though, and the noise continued. I walked over to the bathroom and I slowly opened the door. And what I saw was the most disturbing thing imaginable. It was the same man from earlier at the pool. He must have followed me to my room or something. I immediately tried to close the bathroom door, but he was way more than strong enough to overpower me. He ripped the door back open and it flung me into the bathroom with him. He asked me if I wanted to make $50 and he took his pants off. He then grabbed me by the arm, but I bit his arm as hard as I could. He let go of his grip on me and he slapped me in the face with his other hand. Luckily, it didn't knock me over when he hit me. I ran straight for the door and I managed to escape the room, and I ran to the main lobby once again, and I told the worker at the front desk everything. He called the police right away and the man got arrested. And he was in fact a worker at the hotel, so he was fired as well. CCTV camera footage picked him up sneaking into my room when I was getting snacks at the vending machine. I don't know how he thought he was going to get away with this, but I'm glad nothing worse ended up happening.
I'm 32, so Halloween isn't exactly as fun and exciting as it used to be. Usually I just put up some decorations, and on Halloween night I'll hand out candy and spend the evening watching movies. This was in 2022. I spent most of my morning cleaning up my house and picking up candy from the store, preparing for trick-or-treaters that night. Then around 3, I left the door cracked open so I could hear if anyone was approaching, and then I turned on a movie. Our neighborhood isn't really the biggest, so we don't usually get a ton of kids, but this year it felt different. I hadn't had a single trick-or-treater for 2 hours. I got up and looked outside. The whole street was empty and quiet. I guess Halloween isn't as big of a thing as it used to be, but still, I hoped I would get at least a few people, so I stayed ready for any possible stops at my place. It wasn't until 6:30 that I got the first ring at my doorbell. I got up and went to grab the candy bowl when I noticed there was someone looking into the house at me. They were wearing a costume with some kind of white mask that covered everything but their eyes. Obviously, I had left the door cracked open, but it was still weird to be looking into my house like that. I walked over and held out the bowl and told them to take a handful. It was as they reached into the bowl, though, that I realized they were alone. It was just this one person, and something about them seemed off. They were taller than most kids, and when I got a closer look at their eyes, I could tell they were older. The whites of their eyes were bloodshot, and I could faintly see dark circles under them. I thought it was weird, but I really didn't care too much since no other trick-or-treaters were out. I also didn't want to embarrass them by calling them out. Maybe they were just some older-looking kid. I don't know. When they walked off, I set the bowl down and went back to the movie. I want to say 15 or so minutes went by before I heard a sound that sounded like a footstep right outside my front door. Thinking it was another trick-or-treater, I got up again, but when I turned around, my heart skipped a beat, seeing a person standing inside my house. It was that same one that was here earlier, with the creepy white mask. He was standing by my front door still, but fully inside my home. "Can I help you?" He stared at me for a really intense few seconds before he backed out and left the house. I stood in shock for a moment before I went up to the front door. The person was walking down my driveway, but looked back several times as if they were trying to see if I was watching. I closed the door. Now this was strange. Not only did he enter my home, but why the hell did he come back anyway? I felt like there was no way it could be a kid now, and was almost definitely some creepy guy in a costume with some really disturbing intentions. I didn't feel safe with him wandering the streets on Halloween night with kids around, so I took my phone out to call the police and report him. I heard footsteps approaching the door again, but this time they didn't ring the doorbell or knock or anything. I quietly walked over and looked out the peephole to see who it was and what they were doing. Almost like they knew I was approaching the door, they called out, "Hello? I'm looking for my kid. Have you seen them? Hello?" There was a man, looking mid-40s, wearing regular clothes, like a brown long-sleeve t-shirt and blue jeans. I didn't quite trust this though, and I'm glad I didn't. The man looked around for a moment, then leaned a little closer to the door. When he did, I could see dark circles under his eyes and could tell they were bloodshot. My face went pale. I backed away and quietly continued the call with the police in the other room. After a few minutes, I went back to check out the front door, and the man was gone. Police made it a few minutes later, where we quickly found a costume with a white mask hidden in a bush on the side of my property, clearly having been taken off in a rush. This was the man's attempt to pretend he was someone else. Unfortunately, they weren't able to find the man that night though. I just really hope he wasn't able to follow through on whatever he was intending to do that night. Obviously, with his strange behavior, showing up to my house 3 times and pretending to be someone looking for his kid, he definitely had something disturbing planned. It was late October. I was a sophomore at university and lived in my dorm room with a girl named Kylie. She was a good roommate, everything considered, though we didn't always talk much. She was very social, and I was more closed off. Come Halloween weekend though, she invited me to come to a party with her at a friend's house. She really thought I'd have fun and maybe make some new friends. Plus, it was at an actual house, so I wouldn't be cramped up in a dorm room all night. I initially rejected the offer, but after a bit of convincing, I decided to go. I picked up a really awful looking ghost costume at Spirit Halloween, and at 8, Kylie ordered an Uber to drop us off at her friend's place. It was about 10 minutes from campus, but this wasn't a very big town, so it felt like we were in a whole new area. It was basically an empty road with just this one large house on it. There were orange lights strung all over the outside and tons of blow-up Halloween decorations. We headed inside, and it was surprisingly not that crowded. There were maybe 10 or 15 people around my age. Anyway, we drank and played some games for several hours. It was actually kind of fun, and I was happy I went. By 1 a.m. though, I was tired and burnt out. I found Kylie and asked if she wanted to go, but she was too drunk and said she was just going to spend the night. I didn't feel comfortable enough with any of the others to ask for a ride, especially since they were drunk and mostly all dudes. I stood outside while trying to figure out what to do. I opened up the Uber app, but I really wasn't trying to spend $30 for a 10-minute ride. Not to mention I probably barely even had $30 in my bank account. I was definitely a little tipsy too, which certainly fogged my judgment. I ended up saying screw it and decided I could just walk back to campus. A 10-minute car ride must be like a 35 to 40-minute walk, or at least that's what I thought. I headed down the road, leaving the bright lights of the house, and very quickly getting into the barren, dark, and eerie section of the road. The streetlights were spread out really far, so I'd be in the light for a minute, then walk in the dark for several minutes before reaching the next light. It was pretty soon into the walk, though, that I noticed a car behind me. It was odd because it seemed like they were parked on the side of the road, which I know I never walked past them. But every few minutes when I'd look back, they had moved further down the road toward me. I tried to keep an eye on them, but at one point I looked back and had suddenly lost sight of them. It was a bit foggy out, but I don't know where they went. Maybe they turned around. I kept walking, but increasingly got more uneasy, feeling like I was being watched from somewhere. 5 minutes went by as I kept walking along the side of the road before I heard a car engine behind me. I turned around and saw a car coming through the fog, and their headlights were off. They were slowing down too, and came rolling to a stop right beside me. There was a man in the front seat with a patchy beard and a strange smile. "Where are you heading? It's a bit late to be walking out here alone." I just said I was okay, and kept on walking, but the man inched forward in the car, matching my pace and staying right beside me. "I'll give you a lift. You really shouldn't be out here," he yelled through his window, but through his voice, I could tell there was something different about him. As I started to say no thanks, I looked over at him. His smile was gone, and his face was tense. His eyes stared at me with an aggression, like he wasn't giving me a choice. I stuttered over my words as the man suddenly stopped the car and swung his door open. He started quickly getting out, and just then, a pair of headlights broke through the fog. Another car was coming down the road. I sprinted to the middle of the street and started waving my arms for them to stop, and the creepy man went right back into his car. As the other cars started to slow down, the man sped away. It turned out to be one of the guys from the party, on his way home. Though I only recognized his face, I didn't even know his name. I told him what happened, and he gave me a lift back to campus. I don't think I'd ever sobered up faster than when that guy jumped out of his car, but honestly, if nobody had come to help, I probably would have been on the missing persons list right now, with zero evidence on where I could be. It was Halloween day. I was in 8th grade at the time, and my friend group felt like this year we were a little too old to be trick-or-treating. This would be the first year that we weren't going out though, and being that the previous 10 years we'd always trick-or-treat on Halloween, we were left without anything to do. I mean, we didn't know what else there really was to do. Most of my group decided to just stay home and chill, maybe hand out candy or whatever, but me and my best friend Tyler thought otherwise. We wanted to do something, literally anything. That night, I went over to Tyler's place, and we came up with a plan to explore somewhere he'd heard about. To the best of our knowledge, it was some kind of abandoned tunnel or underground mine or something that was abandoned in the woods just a few miles south of our town. Now, I'd heard of it briefly before too, but neither of us really knew what it was. Tyler was able to get some directions from a buddy of his, so with the plan set, we hopped on our bikes and rode to the other side of town. There were a lot of people out walking around, but very few cars, and as we got closer to the woods, there were way less houses, and obviously way less people as well. Both of us kind of expected other kids to have the same idea as us, so not seeing anyone out here only made us more excited. We locked up our bikes around a nearby tree, then headed down a small footpath that was right where Tyler's friend said it would be. This was very clearly not a real trail, and just something that formed from other people going this way. It was muddy, overgrown, and really easy to accidentally lose track of. Several times we had to stop and turn around to figure out where the path was. Obviously, it was dark out, and Tyler only had one flashlight at his place, so I was just following close behind him as he lit up the way. I want to say it took about 40 minutes of walking for us to finally reach a clearing in the trees. On the other side of the clearing, there was the entrance to the tunnel. It was a small hole going into the side of a hill, and from that far, it was just completely pitch black beyond the entrance. We were pretty sure now that it was some kind of old mine though. Tyler walked up to the opening, and I stayed right behind him. He shined his light in, and it was honestly really creepy. It was extremely dusty and was just this rugged rock tunnel that looked like it was endless. At one point before we entered, I instinctively looked behind us at the woods we came from, and for an instant, I thought I saw something move. It was by one of the trees near the path. I immediately told Tyler to shine his light over there, but when scanning the area, we saw nothing. I didn't know if I was just scaring myself or if I actually saw something, but being with my buddy gave me a false sense of confidence. Tyler moved the light back into the tunnel, then we both hesitantly stepped in. The dust particles fluttered across the beam of light as we slowly made our way down. It was really quiet in there, and each footstep echoed through the tunnel for an eerie amount of time, almost like it was miles long. We didn't get too far in though, before we heard something ahead of us. It sounded like a voice. It was quiet, like they were whispering, but the echo carried the sound close enough for us to hear it. Tyler held his light steady as far down the tunnel as it could go, but there was still an endless pit of darkness beyond it. Almost like we read each other's minds, both of us simultaneously pivoted and started quickly walking back toward the opening. As we walked away, I could hear the voices behind us getting louder. Either they were talking louder, or they were coming up behind us. But every time I looked back, it was entirely darkness, even just 5 feet away. We finally made it to the opening, and just then, Tyler stopped abruptly. Standing just 10 yards away was an unknown man. He was in the middle of the clearing, looking like he was just walking toward the opening we were coming from. Both of us bolted out and straight for the trees. I didn't have the courage to turn around to check if he chased us. Eventually though, we ran out of breath and slowed down, to which we were able to go in the general direction back to town. As we walked back, we talked about what the hell just happened. What we think is that the man we saw outside the tunnel was likely going to trap us inside, or at least block our way out. I mean, why else would a grown man be alone in the woods on Halloween night, exploring an abandoned place that he knew kids would probably be going to? It doesn't make any sense. As for the people inside the mine, it could have been other kids, or someone working with the man in the woods. We got really lucky though to have turned around and left when we did, because even 10 seconds later, that man could have been at the entrance, blocking our only way out and forcing us further into the tunnel.
My name is Susan. During college, I was a babysitter on one of those Find a Babysitter apps. I got to work whenever I wanted, and I made pretty good money. Usually, I would just be babysitting for a few hours at a time or maybe overnight, and I had several regular clients who rebooked me multiple times. I enjoyed it too. I don't necessarily want kids of my own, but I'm kind of the cool aunt who lets the rules slide just enough for the kids to give glowing reviews of me when the parents got home. If they were old enough to talk, that is. I did it for a long time without getting stuck with any nightmare children, but my luck did run out eventually. This one kid, Carter, almost made me quit babysitting altogether. I was already apprehensive to babysit him, as he was on the older side at 10 years old, which is about the age when kids get more complicated. However, it was for a whole week, Monday through Friday, so the money was just too good to pass up. All my classes were online, so I could study the whole time and have the whole weekend to myself. When I met the parents, I felt better about things. They were both very nice people, and Carter seemed like a normal, lazy kid. They said he mostly spent his time playing video games and had a pretty set diet of easy-to-make stuff. They told me not to bother trying to get him to clean his room, and just to keep the rest of the house tidy. At that point, I thought the week was going to be a cinch. But then the parents left, and Carter switched up right away. He started running laps around the house, making loud engine sounds as he passed by me. At first, I thought I should let him expel some energy since I wasn't told to enforce any rules about running. However, Carter bumped into a table seemingly on purpose and came very close to breaking a glass vase, so I had to lay down the law. Carter didn't take well to being told not to run. He got angry and argued with me about it for a bit before I sent him to his room to play video games. He left, but before he slammed the door, he looked straight at me from down the hall and said, "I don't like you," in the typical mocking tone of an angry little boy. That was definitely the worst possible foot we could have started off on, so to speak. But I didn't worry about it being much worse than that. Of course, it wasn't that simple. It seemed like Carter was intentionally testing every single boundary of what he could get away with. When I picked them up and knocked on his door to tell him to put them away, I discovered the absolute den of clutter and chaos that was his room. Thank God his parents didn't make me do anything about it. On top of that, he had his game console in there, which he played at the max volume until I told him to turn it down. He was definitely disobeying his bedtime every single night, but I couldn't do much about that. I just had to ignore the sounds of explosions and screaming while I was trying to study. Carter wasn't just a poorly behaved spoiled brat either. He was also a little creep. For a 10-year-old, he sure knew a lot of dirty words and things about how intimate physical actions were carried out. On Thursday, I noticed he smelled awful. I knew I would have to get him to take a shower, but it was a horrible struggle forcing him to do it. After an hour of fighting over it, he finally went into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Then, for the first time all week, I had a chance to go into his room without him being there. I couldn't help my curiosity. I had to know what other nasty secrets this kid had. After a bit of digging, I found an odd little handmade booklet. It was titled, all the ways I want to kill Susan. The first page said, "I hate Susan so much. If I knew she wouldn't tattle to my parents, I'd punch her." Then, there was a bad drawing of a giant fist smashing my face. Things just got worse as I kept turning the pages. There were lots of spelling errors, but the message was clear. Susan makes me put away my guns. I want to shoot her. Followed by a machine gun turning me into Swiss cheese. Susan doesn't let me run in the house. I want to cut off her feet. With a drawing of 2 bloody stumps and severed feet. If Susan wasn't so ugly, I would F her to death. With the full curse word, followed by a graphic depiction of something I don't want to talk about. Watching her sleep in my parents' bed made me want to set the house on fire. The picture had me burning alive in bed and screaming for help as Carter watched. I was mortified. I quickly took pictures of everything and sent them to his parents. But before I could get any reply, I heard a voice behind me. It was Carter. He was fully clothed, holding a pocket knife. He said he was going to kill me. Then he charged at me. I quickly got out of the way and ran out of the room, slamming his door shut. I held it closed for dear life as Carter started stabbing the door. I was able to hold the door closed with one hand and called his parents to tell them what was happening. They didn't believe me until they went and looked at the photos I sent them. But they still asked me to stay the last night and wait for them to get there. There was no chance of that happening. They had a family friend come over to watch Carter for the night. I took my payment and packed up all my stuff, never to go near that neighborhood again, even after taking a few weeks off. That freak monster of a kid scarred me. I dread to think what he'll become when he gets older. There's something extremely wrong with him. When I lost my husband to a car crash, it felt like my heart had been cleaved in two. I left everything behind. My old neighborhood, my friends, the home that Marcus and I had built together, because everything was too painful. Our 6-year-old son, Daniel, and I moved into a quiet tree-lined neighborhood where no one knew us or our grief. I figured a fresh start might help both of us. Our little house was modest but cozy, with a large living room window overlooking the street. Daniel quickly settled into his new school routine, and I took comfort in seeing a bit of his usual brightness returning, especially after his first few days at school. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found him by the window, a tiny hand raised in an enthusiastic wave.
Who are you waving to, sweetie?
I asked, amused.
"Oh, just a friend,"
he replied with a shy grin. I smiled, relieved. Making friends already, I thought. I saw that as a good sign. Maybe things really would get better here. The next afternoon, there he was again, by the window, waving down at the empty street. This time I approached him to see who it was.
You should invite your friend over sometime.
I suggested, ruffling his hair and peering at the empty street.
It'd be nice to meet him.
Daniel glanced up at me, his face serious.
"Arthur's a little shy, Mommy."
Arthur. I tried not to read too much into the name. Maybe somebody names their kid after their parents. Then came the oddities. A week or so passed and Daniel's behavior grew unsettling. I'd catch him talking in his sleep, mumbling words too quiet to understand. Sometimes laughing softly in the darkness. There were nights I'd wake up to find him standing by the window, staring out into the blackness. When I'd ask him what he was looking at, he'd just mumble, "Arthur likes the night." Then the worst happened. I'd been tidying his room. His crayons were left scattered across the floor. There, on a crumpled piece of paper, was a face. Pale, hollowed eyes staring up at me, surrounded by scratchy, childlike lines. In the middle of the forehead was a small, dark red dot. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring right through me. When Daniel got home, I held up the drawing, trying to keep my voice steady.
Who's this, Daniel?
He looked at me in a way that made my skin prickle. A stare so cold, so distant, it couldn't belong on a 6-year-old's face. Seconds passed, stretching out painfully. And just when I thought he wouldn't answer, He turned his gaze to the window. Slowly, as if reluctant, he whispered,
That's Arthur, Mommy.
I froze, swallowing the lump in my throat. I forced a smile.
Oh, why does he have a red dot on his forehead?
Without looking at me, he replied,
'Cause he has a hole there. Arthur said a bad man shot him.
I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just an imaginary friend's story. There was something chillingly specific in his words. I pulled him close.
Daniel, how did you meet Arthur?
He looked up at me, eyes innocent and young.
He was there, Mommy, at Daddy's funeral. He was standing right next to Daddy's grave.
A sickening chill ran through me, freezing my breath in my throat.
Where is he now?
Daniel's gaze drifted to the living room window. His little face was eerily calm.
He's not shy anymore, Mommy. He wants to come in.
He paused, his mouth stretching into a small, strange smile. That was enough for me. I grabbed him as I rushed us out of the house. I didn't stop until we were safe at my mother's. My hands shook. My mind spiraled in fear and confusion. I needed help. Real help. For the next 2 weeks, we prayed. My mother insisted we go to church. She dragged us every day without fail. A bishop performed a cleansing ritual, muttering prayers over us as he sprinkled holy water on Daniel and me. I clung to hope, desperate for the nightmare to end. Slowly, gradually, the shadows faded, and the whispers stopped. The nights returned to their silent, ordinary darkness. And Arthur, he vanished. It was exactly a year later when I returned to the cemetery. I brought flowers and knelt by Marcus's grave. I whispered a few words, telling him how we were doing, and how Daniel was growing up so quickly. As I rose to leave, my gaze fell on the grave beside his. A simple, unassuming stone that hadn't been there before. Curious, I stepped closer and read the inscription. Arthur Miller, an ideal son and a loving husband, gone too soon on the battlefield, fighting for his country. Everyone who knew him will always be proud of him. A single red poppy had been placed by the stone. Its delicate petals were bright and stark against the grass, just over a small circular indent in the stone's surface. A scar left by something small, round, and sharp. A shiver coursed through me. I could almost feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere just beyond the veil of reality. At that moment, I could have sworn I heard Daniel's small, haunting voice in my head, echoing through the silent graveyard.
He's not shy anymore, Mommy. He wants to come in.
I used to babysit my little brother Joey a lot. He was fairly easy to take care of. He was only in kindergarten, but he walked home from the bus stop every day and could make himself a PB&J, among other things. So he was pretty independent for his age. He was also very capable of entertaining himself with toys and drawing, so I got to do my own thing. One day, though, while our parents were gone, I was bored and felt like Joey might be lonely. He was on the floor of his bedroom, drawing with the door open. I asked if I could come in, and he said yes. I went over to him and looked at what he was working on. There were 3 other drawings on the floor, crude portraits of me and her mom and dad. Joey was scribbling together a 4th portrait, but I didn't recognize it. I didn't interrupt him, though. I just watched it come together. It was a man, but Joey only bothered to draw the details of the top half of his face before grabbing a red crayon and scribbling a giant triangle over where his nose and mouth would have been. As Joey filled the triangle in with a bunch of swirls, I noticed that the size of the head matched the size of the portraits of her parents, being bigger than mine or Joey's, signaling that the person was an adult, whoever they were. However, when Joey finished the drawing and gathered the other ones to arrange them, he put her mom and dad together on top, then below them, me, the unknown man, and Joey, in that order, as if he was a kid like us. I asked Joey who the man was. He replied very plainly,
That's the bandana man,
he said, I asked if that was his imaginary friend, and in the same nonchalant tone, he said, "No, he's real." I was a bit worried, so I asked a few more questions. Apparently, the man wore the bandana so he wouldn't get sick. This was during that time period, so that sort of checked out. Joey also said that he and the bandana man played almost every night. That information struck me as very hard to believe unless the bandana man was imaginary, because I knew Joey had only been playing alone. Unfortunately, when I asked if they had been playing past his bedtime, he stopped answering. I could tell he was getting annoyed with me, so I figured I should drop it for the moment. A few hours passed and our parents came home. By then, Joey had put all the drawings on the fridge. When my parents saw the bandana man, they were also concerned. However, they weren't able to get any more information out of Joey than me. We all figured Joey had conjured it up after seeing a cowboy movie or something, and tried not to fixate on it. But the drawing was right there in the kitchen, staring at me every time I sat down to eat a bowl of cereal in the morning. I couldn't get the image out of my head. One evening, on a Saturday, my parents were going to some big dinner party and said they wouldn't be home until around midnight, so we were supposed to be asleep when they arrived. I got Joey into bed around 9, but I stayed up for another hour or so before I went to bed. I lied awake for what must have been 30 minutes. Then I started to hear Joey talking to himself or his imaginary friend. I knew he wasn't supposed to be awake, but I didn't get up to tell him to go back to bed just then. I was very comfortable and didn't want to move. I contemplated letting Joey get in trouble if he got caught, or maybe just hollering at him from my bed. But after a few minutes, something else happened. There was a very light knock on my door. Then Joey's voice asking if he could come in. I said yes, and as he slowly opened the door, Joey said, "The bandana man wants to play with you." My blood ran ice cold when I saw a tall man standing behind Joey, wearing a red bandana as a mask. As I stared in shock and disbelief, the bandana man entered my room and approached my bed. I could hear his breath, heavy and excited. His eyes were wide with hunger. Then, Joey spoke again. "He doesn't want to play with me tonight. Just you," he said. Then he closed the door. I finally snapped out of it and screamed at the top of my lungs. I tried to jump out of the bed to run, but the man pounced on me, pinning me down. I kept screaming and trying to get away, but he crawled over me, keeping my arms down with his knees. He took the bandana from his face and stuffed it into my mouth. Then, he undid his belt and tightly wrapped it around my head to keep it in place. Just as I realized there was no way out of what was about to happen to me, I heard my dad calling out that he was home and that we had better be in bed. A moment later, he started scolding Joey for being up. Suddenly, the man jumped off me and ran out of the room. My dad shouted at him and I heard him start to run. But the man managed to get back into Joey's room and escape through the window. I took that crap off my face and screamed louder than I ever had, immediately beginning to cry. I sobbed for a long time before I was able to say anything about what happened. I told the police everything, and they questioned Joey about it. The bandana man had befriended Joey one day on his walk home from the bus stop. Everybody was wearing a mask around that time, so he didn't stick out. He came into Joey's window every night and came to play with Joey, asking him questions about us and our parents, gathering information. When he knew our parents wouldn't be home for the night, he finally asked Joey to take him to me. If my parents hadn't come home an hour early because my mother wasn't feeling well, that would have been the worst hour of my life, potentially my last.
I met Jack outside of a restaurant at one of the lowest points of my life. My boyfriend of over 2 years was leaving me for my best friend. He said that we have lost our spark, whatever that's supposed to mean. But that breakup is now a blessing because here I am getting married to one of the greatest guys on earth. After exchanging our wedding vows and all the wedding festivities, we made our way out of the church and jumped into our car, ready to start our new life together. Jack had booked a small cabin for us to spend 2 weeks on our honeymoon together. Upon reaching our location, I was a little concerned about the isolation. but remained quiet because I knew Jack had to put a lot of work into planning this getaway. We packed our things in a boat that visitors used to cross the lake. We began to make our way across the lake to the cabin. After reaching the house, I realized that the island lacked modern amenities such as electricity, television, internet, and running water. In fact, there wasn't even phone reception here. Jack saw my frustration and asked if I wanted to leave, but I said no. We're already here, so we might as well make the best of it. After entering into the cabin, I noticed over the fireplace 4 photos of 4 young ladies. I didn't think anything of it, so we settled in. When I woke up the following morning, I noticed that Jack had placed the car keys and all our money in a safe box, holding the safe box key near him like a locket. I asked him why he was doing that, and he just said it was for safety so that we didn't lose anything. I pushed it out of my mind and I started to enjoy myself on the island. I went for swims, sunbathing, and just enjoying nature to the fullest. After a couple days of this routine, it kind of became boring, and I was ready to go home. So I proposed to Jack that we shorten our honeymoon and go back to civilization. Jack, however, seemed preoccupied and disregarded what I was saying to him, focusing instead on setting up an animal trap. In the night, I was unable to sleep. I just wanted to go home. So in the morning, I told him again that I wanted to leave this place, stating that 10 days in nature is more than enough. Jack bluntly responded that 10 days was not enough, and that I was not leaving this island anytime soon. What? I responded. What do you mean that I'm not leaving this island anytime soon? Jack's tone now turned threatening and said, "We are here to stay. You are not leaving." I now realized that the man I fell in love with truly has a dark side. To keep things calm, I walked off and went inside the cabin. The following morning, I began to plead with him, saying that if you love me, that you'll let us leave this place, that I just wanted to go home. But something about Jack suddenly changed. His eyes turned a bright red, and he looked at me saying, "You are just like the others." On repeat, "You are just like the others." He reached for the knife on the table and rushed towards me. I sprinted out of the cabin and grabbed a piece of firewood, striking him on the head. As he was on the ground, I grabbed the key to the safe box from around his neck. Then I rushed inside to open the box and took out the car keys and made my way towards the boat. While leaving this wretched island, I looked back and noticed that Jack was awake and started to swim after me. Reaching the other side of the lake, I quickly ran towards the area I think that we parked at. Making my way towards the vehicle, suddenly I tripped over something. Upon closer observation, I realized that it seemed to be 4 separate graves. Suddenly, I heard Jack screaming out my name in the distance. "Jill!" With no time to think, I rushed towards the car, but it refused to start. Jack was now right up against the driver's window, shouting at me to come out. Just then, I remembered that we always kept a gun in the glove compartment of the car. So, I pulled it out and I ordered him to fix the car. He told me to open the car bonnet, but it was a trick. When I looked down for the thing that opens the car bonnet, I heard a loud smash. The next day, I woke up tied to a tree with ropes. Jack's demeanor totally changed as he just kept saying, "You are just like the others." Again and again, "You are just like the others." "What others?" I asked. This is where he started to explain. My other 4 wives wanted to leave as well, so I had to kill them. But wife number 5, I was hoping would be different. "You mean the 4 photos inside of those ladies? The 4 graves near our car? My God, you killed them?" "Yeah, I did. And you are next." He left me tied up and went to the other side of the house. But when I realized that he wasn't in sight, I rubbed the rope on a sharp stone nearby to break it. After a few seconds, he was coming back with an axe in his hands. I rushed into the house, saw the gun, and shouted at him to stop, but he kept coming towards me with the axe. So, I pulled the trigger, hitting him in the chest. He fell to the ground, unable to move. I stood above him with the guns in my hand, pointed at him. I couldn't finish him off, so I tossed the gun towards him and made my way off the island. When I was halfway to the other side, I heard a loud boom.
My name's Ethan. And yeah, I've heard it all before. You're too old for this. But they don't get it. The Grinch isn't just a character to me. He's something more. I mean, I'm a sucker for this stuff. Posters, toys, collector's items, you name it, I have it. My house is literally like the Grinch exploded in it. People tend to think it's quirky or weird, but they don't see what I see. The Grinch was clever and misunderstood, a genius. But things went sideways last Christmas. It started in a flea market. Just walking through, scouring over all the tables for any Grinch, I saw it. An old dusty Grinch toy perched atop some wonky table. It was unlike any other I've ever seen though. Fur matted, green plotting instead of richly vibrant, and eyes. And glow kinda almost like they're breathing in that dim light. When I picked it up, it was warm. Not warm like it sat out in the sun all day. Warm like if it were alive. My chest constricted, and I reassured myself that it was just my excitement. How much? I asked the seller. The old man behind the table didn't even look at me. Take it, he muttered. No charge. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I sat the toy on my shelf, right in the middle of my Grinch collection. It was perfect there. Too perfect. As I gazed at it, a creeping, crawling feeling went up my spine as if it looked back at me. Then the whisper started. I thought it might just be the wind, or perhaps the neighbors, but it was whispered inside the house. Faint, soft, just out of earshot. They seemed to come from nowhere, and from everywhere, and it only got worse. Every time I passed a mirror, my reflection seemed off. My nose looked longer, my cheeks hollow. One night, I swore I saw my face twist into a Grinch-like grin before snapping back to normal. The decorations around my house seemed different somehow. The Grinches on my shelves seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention. Their smiles grew thinner, their eyes deeper. I tried to think myself into agreement with my mind, but the fact remained within me. I knew. And then the dreams came. I saw him every night. The Grinch. But it was not the playful mischievousness of his daily endeavors. He was taller and leaner, his green fur darker, more patchy. His grin went on too long, and jagged and sharp were his teeth. I envisioned him standing at the foot of my bed. He watched me, whispering things I couldn't understand. "Follow me," he said one night in a deep guttural voice. I wake up drenched in sweat with my heart racing. That was when I started digging. I needed answers. I spent days researching and surfing all obscure forums and old books dedicated to Christmas folklore. And that's how I found the legend of a cursed Grinch toy. According to the stories, it wasn't only a collector's item, it was a trap. It pulled people in, feeding on their obsession, slowly turning them into what they so admired. Something inside me didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there. Whispers, distorted reflections, and dreams. I tried to eliminate the toy. I threw it in the trash, but the next morning, there it was back on my shelf. I burned it, but it came back. Its fur singed, its grin even wider. I was losing my mind. Christmas Eve. That's when I finally saw myself. This time, however, it wasn't me. The face in the mirror was green, and its grin was stitched into its cheeks. I screamed and punched the glass, but the image didn't break. That's when I realized I wasn't just seeing the Grinch, I was becoming him. The next thing I remember is standing in my bathroom staring into the mirror with a knife in my hand. Blood was dripping from my cheeks because I carved out a grin. All I can recall is looking back at an awful distorted grin. Now I'm here, locked away in this mental institution. They say I'm dangerous, that I hurt myself and scared my neighbors, but they don't understand. The Grinch is real. He's here. I can hear the guards talking about me every now and then. Poor guy, one of them said. His obsession destroyed him. The other replied, yeah, who carves a grin into their own face? They don't know what I know. They can laugh all they want, but every night I see him, the Grinch, standing in the corner of my room, his grin wider than ever. He's waiting. For what, I don't know, but I can feel it. He's not done with me yet. I visited my parents for Christmas last year. It had been snowing since October, so my dad helped me switch over to winter tires over a month earlier. That made me think I didn't have to worry much about road conditions. My family and I had a wonderful Christmas together, but I had plans to go on vacation with a friend the following day. Our flight was scheduled for that afternoon. I left in the early morning when it was still dark out, so I could have ample time to prepare for the trip and arrive at the airport. Unfortunately, I hadn't paid enough attention to how much snow had fallen the previous night. I quickly realized that the winter tires alone might not cut it, but I was determined to get home. Once there, I could just get a ride. Unfortunately, there was a dark and lonely 20 miles between me and my destination. I pressed on at a cautious speed. Everything seemed fine until I crossed over a small bridge. Then, out of nowhere, I hit a patch of black ice. My car rotated one way and started sliding the other way, completely out of my control. I rammed into a pile of snow underneath. But thankfully, I wasn't going fast enough to cause any damage to the car. On the other hand, the snow caved in under one tire, causing me to get stuck. I tried not to panic. I had never had to get myself out of snow before, but my dad told me how. When I stepped out, though, all my confidence was blown away by the brutally cold wind and the realization that I was completely alone on that stretch of road. When I refocused, I grabbed all the floor mats from the back seat and the box of cat litter from the trunk. I got on my hands and knees and cleared a path for my back tires, packing down the softer snow into hard ice. I laid down the litter with mats and tried as hard as I could to cram them under the tires. I was working under the light of a single flashlight, feeling like I was on a fast track to hypothermia as my fingers started to get stiff and my face went numb. Just as I was ready to give it a try, I saw a pair of headlights approaching behind me. I flagged them down, trying to warn them about the ice. They seemed to go over it with no problem, and as they pulled over next to me, I saw that they had chains on their tires. It was another larger SUV, driven by a scruffy middle-aged man with gloves on who offered to help. I declined, saying I was already taking care of it. But then he took a glance at my setup and said there was no chance of that working. He hopped out of his car, revealing a stained jacket over a large gun, saying he'd help tow me from the ditch. I told him again that I had things handled, but he glared at me, demeaning. He said a little lady like me couldn't handle anything on her own, and that I was no good to anyone if I froze to death. I was offended. My teeth were chattering so much I couldn't go off on him for being such a chauvinist, and what I could get out was lost in the wind. All I could do was watch him pop open his trunk and pull out a long chain, which he looped through an attachment point under the front bumper of my car. Then, he told me to kneel there and hold it while he grabbed something to lock it in place. I managed to ask him why he didn't just tie the chain in a knot, but he snapped at me asking if I knew anything about towing cars. I tried to snap back by saying I never asked him for a tow, but he pointed at my floor mats and cat litter and said it was the stupidest, most brain-dead method of getting out of snow. If he left, he said I'd be stuck there all morning until the snowplows came to bury me. In the freezing cold, looking at my handiwork once again, I had to admit the tow seemed like a better option. I swallowed my pride and did as he said, kneeling at the hood of the car with the chain in my hands. A moment later, the man returned, handing me an open padlock. I noticed he was holding one hand behind his back, which as he stood looming over me, was no good omen. My inner voice was screaming at me at this point that my initial feelings about this guy were right. However, I tried to keep going along with things while still being extra cautious. So I kept one eye on him as I turned away to secure the chain. I only got the lock through one link before I saw him raise his arms over his head out of the corner of my eye. I looked over my shoulder and saw a hammer ready to strike me in the back of the head. I quickly jumped out of the way just before he slammed it into the bumper. I yanked the chain out from under my car, whipping it across his face as he went to hit me again. He shouted in pain as I ran around to the passenger side, jumping in and locking the doors just moments before he reached the window and started hammering the glass. I crawled over to the driver's seat, praying I wouldn't be stuck. I heard my dad's voice again saying, "Don't floor it." So against my panicking instincts, I feathered the throttle until I felt the tires catch, and then I finally slammed on the gas pedal. I roared out of the ditch, speeding off to safety. The creep didn't come after me, but he smashed my window. When I got home, I called the police immediately and reported everything. But since I didn't have the license plate, they didn't really do much. The rest of my day was very strange, trying to go through with my trip after what happened. It's horrible to think that there's a kind of person in this world that goes around looking for people in need of help, just to take advantage of their vulnerability. I used to work at a 7-Eleven that closed at midnight on Christmas Eve. I worked that closing shift one year. I wasn't supposed to be alone, but my coworker no-called no-showed. The night was painfully slow. After 11:30, no more people were coming in, so I started getting ready to close. I got almost everything done, then I went to count the register. I was about to open the drawer when I heard a faint noise coming from outside. It sounded like jingle bells. As I paused to listen to it, the sound got louder and closer. I looked outside and saw a man dressed as Santa Claus. He was crossing the street, heading right for the store. While he walked, he shook a leather strap of jingle bells in one hand. He was staring right at me, even at a distance and through the glass door. I could tell. He came all the way up to it, then he stopped just outside. He went silent, no longer shaking his bells, just staring at me. He had a strange look in his eyes. It wasn't like a crazy or high person. It was different. They were so empty, yet so full of joy. I looked away at the clock. It was 11:57, so I couldn't bar him from the store. Against my better judgment, I welcomed him in. He opened the door and took one step inside, then stepped on the floor mat, still staring at me. He made a sudden and unnerving series of deep shouts. Ho, ho, ho! It took me a moment to realize that was his version of ho, ho, ho. It sounded like one of those holiday greeting cards with a worn-out tape recording. Standing in the same spot, he asked what a little boy like me was still doing up. I replied that I was working and the store closed at midnight, but he said I was being naughty and needed to go to sleep so he could put my presents under the tree. I kept being straight with him and said there was no tree and that he needed to buy something. To that, he scoffed and said Santa Claus never buys anything on Christmas. No. Good little boys and girls were supposed to leave milk and cookies out for him. That's when he raised his strap of jingle bells and shook it as he started walking. He took the last cookie on display that I was saving for myself. Then he went over to the coolers. He grabbed a bottle of whole milk, cracked it open, then proceeded to unwrap the cookie and cram the whole thing into his mouth in about 2 bites, washing it down with an entire bottle of milk. I shouted at him that he was going to have to pay for that, but he just glanced over at me and jingled his stupid bells again. After clearing his throat, he thanked me for the milk and cookies but told me that I still had to go to sleep if I wanted to receive my present. I said I wasn't going to play his game and that in 1 minute I was going to kick him out, but he just rang his bells again, then said he could be very patient. We locked eyes for the next 60 seconds. When the clock struck midnight, I told him the store was closed, and without skipping a beat, he started violently shaking his bells and screamed, "Merry Christmas!" at the top of his lungs. I got fed up and went to confront him. I pointed to the door and told him to leave, but instead of listening, he shook his damn bells again and spoke to me like a child. He said he was proud of me for staying up all the way until midnight to see Santa putting out presents. But it was time for me to go to sleep unless I wanted to be put on the naughty list. I finally lost my cool and shouted in his face to get the hell out. In response, he took the strap of bells into 2 hands, holding them horizontally at chest height as he stepped forward to close the gap between us. I started backpedaling toward the register, not taking my eyes off him as he followed mere inches away. I told him he didn't have to pay, but he didn't care. He just told me it was my bedtime. I kept trying to reason with him, saying I still had to close the store. But then the man raised his voice, scolding me for talking back to him. I apologized, but he said it was already too late. I was on the naughty list, and since I wouldn't go to bed on my own, Santa would have to put me to bed himself. And I was no longer going to get what I wanted for Christmas. Before I could ask what he meant, I realized I was backed up against the counter and he was right on top of me. Suddenly, he pushed me down and wrapped the leather strap of bells around my neck, squeezing and pressing into it with all his weight. I kicked and fought against him, trying to pull the strap away, but I was completely overpowered. All I could hear was him screaming, "Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas!" As the seconds passed, my vision faded and my strength vanished. The last thing I remember is him getting in my face and whispering, "Nothing was stirring, not even a mouse." Then, everything went black, and I could no longer feel. I don't know how long I was like that, but to my surprise, I woke up in a daze. I hadn't been moved, but now there was a horrid sensation in my mouth. I grabbed for it and pulled out a dead rat. I threw it across the store. Looking at it, I realized that its entire nose and mouth were covered in red wax, like it had been suffocated to death prior to being stuffed in my mouth. I would have taken a lump of coal in my mouth over a dead Rudolph rat any day. When I got up, I called the police. Apparently, the Santa Claus guy had been terrorizing and assaulting people with his demented Santa Claus act all night, but my case appeared to be the worst. I always hoped they would find the guy, but many years have passed, and I haven't heard anything about it.